Okay, so we know that there's inequality in the world, but how does international relations deal with it? Well, they start by asking the question, why is there global inequality? And most theories of international relations tend towards the zero-sum theory, basically saying, as we distinguish between the global north and the global south, the global north has always exploited the global south and benefited from it economically. They continue to this day. We're still looking at systems of inequality today that are supported by this divide in the global north and the global south. We can see these in some terms that I think will be fairly familiar already. The global capitalistic market tends to favor Western countries. We see these programs put in place that create debt for Southern countries anytime that the global north tries to help them develop. And we see this long-lasting legacy of imperialism and colonialism that has helped cement a superior economic force that the global north really has no interest in giving up. So just to clarify, in case you're not familiar with some of these ideas of colonialism and imperialism, this was a long period of time where essentially countries of what we would consider to be the global north today either colonized or just flat out invaded countries that were in parts that we would consider the global south. This is a large reason that Africa has not been able to regain any kind of economic dominance in the world, despite having several long-lasting empires that really should have put it in competition with other global powers at the time. And in this period, these Western countries were truly concerned with just exploiting the hell out of these countries as much as they could. They wanted to take any resources, be those natural resources or human resources, from these countries just to benefit their own countries back home in Europe or in North America as we started to develop the areas here. So this includes things like the slave trade. And this period of time really went all the way up until about World War II. It wasn't really until the end of World War II and the decolonization of the British Empire that we saw an end of this period, or at least the end of the traditional period of imperialism and colonialism. Now, we'll come back around to that, but first a couple of theories as to why these systems persist and are still so unequal today. The first of these is the world systems theory. Now, this is an adaptation of Marxism, not directly, so not a direct intellectual heir of Marxism, but an adaptation of Marxism to apply to the global inequality that we see. So this theory states that essentially we are continuing to experience class warfare just on a global scale. We have created these three categories of countries: the core countries, which are obviously places like the United States, European countries, sort of the heads of the United Nations type countries. The periphery, which are the other nations that stand as sort of the support network for those, so the proletariat countries, and then the semi-periphery countries, so the countries that don't quite fall full into that core, but also aren't just supporting and are able to be supported somewhat by the periphery countries. And that sort of system may be an accurate representation of inequality in the world. We see that there are these countries that are basically continuing to exploit other countries for their own economic and their own social benefit. All of this is concerned with how this wealth inequality flows around the world and starts to create sort of a reproducing system. It is self-interested. It is interested with its own continuation, as in the countries that are benefiting from this have the best economic interest in continuing this system as it is, and to continue to exploit the periphery countries that don't have the ability to change their own status within this system. There is no way to have a proletariat uprising. The number of countries that would need to band together to overthrow something like the United States is just too significant for it to ever be a real feasible practice. And that's another way that this does kind of depart from Marxist thought. Similar in some of its language usage to world systems theory is dependency theory. This is basically the idea that the underdeveloped nations of the world become dependent on the core nations for their own development. So they're reliant on them either through direct assistance or even just creating international debt that allows them to then develop their country in some way, shape, or form. And they aren't building truly sustainable development practices. Instead, they're doing the quick and dirty approach to developing or industrializing, and it doesn't leave them with a strong basis for any kind of future development. This means then that the global north can continue this system. Like I said, similar in some ways to world systems theory, the global north is interested in continuing to exploit and continuing to dominate these countries that are just trying to develop. Now, I think these theories really come together in a concept known as NeoColonialism. So NeoColonialism is basically the idea that colonialism never really goes away, it just changes in form. And so instead of colonizing in the way that the Western countries used to, nowadays they do similar things just through creating these systems of dependence. When post-colonial states are forced to enter the same free market economy that some of the world's most powerful economies participate in, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, any of these nations that can essentially overwhelm any of the smaller nations quite easily with their economic dominance, they're not playing on an equal playing field. They are given an instant disadvantage in the global system that helps to reinforce this colonial ideal. And by reinforcing a colonial ideal, it helps to reestablish these ideas of dominance and control that colonialism was so concerned with in the first place. Now, I think we can see this most clearly expressed through some of the enclave economies that exist throughout the world. Places where multinational corporations have the most economic power in a state as opposed to the state government that should be controlling it. And this means that development is wrapped up in those multinational corporations instead of being the responsibility of the state itself. Places like India experience this to an extreme degree. When you look at the differences between Indian development as far as their space program goes and Indian development as far as basic sanitation in its post-colonial era after England left, you see a pretty deep divide here. And I think that these, multinational corporations, specifically something like the East India Company, which was one of the first multinational corporations, give us a different sense of how colonialism may be continuing to this day. And so that gives us an overview of some of these theories of inequality and why inequality still exists to this day. It's not an easy thing to understand. At its core, we do have the economic capability, we have the food, we have the healthcare, we have the ability for all people in the world to be at least on a somewhat more equitable footing than they are now. And yet, that's not the way the world is. We have these systems in place that continue to exploit the global south, and they are put in place by the global north. So we're continuing to struggle with these ideas of inequality and how we should deal with them on an international stage. So hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll talk to you again next time. Thanks. Bye.